The sun had barely risen over the small, tight-knit town of Riverton, casting soft, golden rays across the streets as the world slowly came to life. In the quiet of the morning, the town felt at peace. The smell of fresh coffee wafted through the air as residents began their routines. To most people, it was just another ordinary day. Nothing out of the ordinary, no hint of the storm that was about to hit their community. But for Ethan Kerr, today was anything but ordinary. Ethan had always been a man who walked through life with a sense of self-assurance that bordered on arrogance. He was the kind of person who believed that the rules didn't apply to him, that somehow he was smarter, craftier, and more capable than anyone else. Ethan had committed many crimes over the years, each one more daring than the last. Yet every time, he managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system, evading punishment like a shadow that simply couldn't be caught. He had become the very definition of smugness, a man so confident in his ability to outsmart everyone around him that he considered himself untouchable. Riverton's local authorities had long suspected him of being involved in illicit activities, but they never had enough evidence to make an arrest. Ethan carried the air of someone who could manipulate any situation in his favor. He knew how to charm, how to lie, and most importantly, how to hide the truth from the world. Today, however, Ethan was about to do something different. Today, he was going to pull off his most daring scheme yet, a plan that would not only make him rich, but prove once and for all that no one could outwit him. He had spent weeks meticulously planning every detail, leaving nothing to chance. His target? A well-known local businessman, someone respected by the community, but whose absence wouldn't be noticed immediately. Ethan knew the man's routine, his weaknesses, and most importantly, the way to strike when the time was right. As the clock ticked on, Ethan made his way through the back alleys of the town, the cool morning air brushing against his face. His heart beat with excitement. He had always thrived in moments like this, when he was on the edge, dancing between risk and reward. Today, he felt invincible. Today, he was going to show everyone that he was untouchable. The plan was simple. Kidnap the businessman, demand a hefty ransom, and disappear before anyone could even trace his steps. It was perfect in its simplicity. Unbeknownst to Ethan, however, his plan was about to hit an unexpected snag. Across town, in a courtroom just beginning its morning session, Judge Boyd was preparing for another typical day of hearings. Judge Boyd, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to justice, had earned a reputation for being tough yet fair. He had seen it all, cases ranging from petty theft to murder, and his demeanor was always calm and collected. But beneath his stern exterior, Judge Boyd carried a deep sense of justice. He knew that every case mattered, every life touched by crime, and every victim deserved a fair trial. This was not just any day for Judge Boyd. A case was about to land on his desk that would push his sense of duty to the limit. What neither Ethan nor anyone else could have known was that this very day would mark the beginning of an unrelenting clash of wills, one that would change both their lives forever. As Ethan reached the edge of the town, ready to make his move, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was a small, almost imperceptible sensation, but it was enough to make him pause. Still, he pushed the thought aside. After all, he had everything under control. Or so he thought. Across town, the usual bustle of the morning was interrupted by the sound of sirens. An unsettling sense of urgency filled the air as the police gathered outside the businessman's house. There were whispers, a growing sense of tension, and a collective realization that something terrible had happened. But at that moment, neither Ethan nor the townspeople knew just how deep this mystery would run, or how much they would soon learn about the true cost of underestimating justice. As Ethan made his final preparations, his mind buzzed with the possibilities. He would get away with it. He was sure of it. After all, who could catch someone as clever as him? In the back of his mind, though, there was a nagging thought, a whisper that told him that today wasn't going to go as smoothly as he had planned. Yet he silenced that voice, choosing instead to revel in the excitement of what was to come. What Ethan didn't realize was that today, everything would change. The calm, predictable life he had known in Riverton was about to be shattered. And Judge Boyd, the man he thought he could outsmart, would soon prove to him that no one, no matter how smug or confident, could escape the long arm of the law forever. As Ethan moved forward with his scheme, the gears of justice began to turn, quietly at first, but with a force that would soon become impossible to ignore. The story of Ethan Kerr and Judge Boyd was only just beginning, and it was destined to be one that Riverton would never forget. Ethan's plan was flawless, or so he believed. The target was simple: a local businessman, Jack Monroe, who had lived in Riverton for nearly 2 decades. Jack was known throughout the town as a self-made millionaire, someone who had built his wealth from the ground up, all the while maintaining that carefully cultivated image of generosity and trustworthiness. He owned the largest hardware store in town, a staple of the community. He was the kind of man who seemed untouchable, someone who was respected by all and feared by none. That made him the perfect target in Ethan's eyes. Ethan had spent the past few weeks gathering intel on Jack. He knew every detail about the man's daily routine, from when he left his house in the morning to when he returned at night. He knew Jack's schedule, his favorite places to eat, and even the time it took him to drive from one place to another. Everything was carefully calculated. Ethan had decided that the kidnap would take place in broad daylight, in the middle of the town's bustling business district, where the streets were always filled with people. He knew that the chaos would create just the right distraction, making it easy for him to grab Jack without anyone suspecting anything was wrong. That morning, everything seemed to go according to plan. As Ethan slipped into the alley behind Jack's store, his heart raced with excitement. He was just steps away from his target. Jack Monroe was about to become a pawn in his grand scheme, a man whose life would soon be held in Ethan's hands. Ethan's plan had been simple: grab Jack, take him to a remote location, demand a hefty ransom, and then disappear. He had already arranged for a safe house in the woods, an isolated cabin where he could hide until everything blew over. From there, he would make his demands to Jack's wife, who Ethan knew would do anything to get her husband back. The money would be more than enough to set him up for the rest of his life. But as Ethan peered around the corner, ready to execute his plan, he saw something that made him pause. A black car, sleek and unfamiliar, was parked directly outside Jack's store. A tall figure in a suit was standing by the vehicle, seemingly waiting. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to reconsider. This wasn't part of the plan. He'd never seen this person before, and the last thing he needed was an unexpected complication. But the clock was ticking, and he couldn't afford to back out now. This was his moment. With a deep breath, Ethan pressed forward. He waited for the right moment, when Jack would step outside to inspect his delivery or take a break from his work. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched through the cracked door of the store. The plan had to go off without a hitch or everything would fall apart. He could almost taste the victory in the air. He was so close. Then, just as Jack stepped outside for a quick smoke, Ethan moved. He swiftly approached Jack from behind, his hands outstretched. The surprise was meant to be the key to his success, and he knew that Jack wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight if he was caught off guard. Ethan yanked Jack's arms behind his back and shoved him into the car, where the stranger in the suit was already waiting. The door slammed shut, and just like that, Ethan was in control. The car roared to life, speeding down the narrow town streets. Jack Monroe, still trying to process what had just happened, struggled against the ropes that bound his wrists. He tried to shout, tried to make a scene, but Ethan had already anticipated his every move. The car took a sharp turn and headed out of the town, driving along the familiar road that would lead them to the cabin in the woods. Jack's protests grew louder, but they were met with silence from Ethan. The kidnapper's heart raced with excitement as he thought of the money that would soon be in his hands. But as the car bounced down the gravel road, something strange happened. The weight of the situation, The enormity of what he was doing began to settle in. It was easy to tell himself he was in control, that everything would work out, but now that it was actually happening, the reality of the crime hit him. He had never been this close to someone so influential, someone so well-known. It was no longer just about the money. It was about power, the power to take someone's life and hold it in your hands. Ethan tried to push the thoughts aside. He was too close to let anything derail his plan now. He glanced at Jack in the rearview mirror, who was now looking at him with wide, fearful eyes. Ethan couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt, though he quickly dismissed it. This wasn't personal. It was just business. As the car veered deeper into the woods, the sounds of the town faded into the background, replaced by the soft hum of the engine and the rustling of trees. Soon, the car turned onto an even narrower road, one that led to the small cabin Ethan had secured. It was isolated, far enough from town that no one would come looking anytime soon. The plan was working. Jack Monroe would pay the ransom, and Ethan would disappear without a trace. But as the car rolled to a stop in front of the cabin, Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, expecting to see a message from his contact about the ransom exchange. Instead, the text was from an unknown number. "We know what you did." The words sent a chill down his spine. Ethan quickly locked the phone and shoved it back into his pocket. He tried to shake off the unease that had settled over him. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. When the car doors opened, Ethan pulled Jack out and marched him toward the cabin. The plan was still on track. He told himself everything was fine, but the nagging feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right, and as he shoved Jack into the cabin and secured the door behind him, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to unravel. Little did he know, the small town of Riverton wasn't as quiet or as predictable as it seemed, and his seemingly perfect plan was about to meet a force he had underestimated. The unwavering determination of Judge Boyd and the justice system he had so long thought he could outsmart. The clock in Riverton ticked on, but for Ethan Kerr, time seemed to slow to a crawl. As he paced the dimly lit cabin, his thoughts raced. The kidnapping had gone smoothly, far smoother than he had anticipated. Jack Monroe was now locked in the small, grimy room he had prepared. The businessman's muffled protests echoed through the walls, but Ethan paid them little mind. He had been through this before. He knew how to keep a hostage under control. The next step was simple: wait for the ransom to be paid and then disappear. He had the perfect plan, the perfect escape route, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt invincible. But as the hours dragged on, Ethan's confidence began to waver. The strange text he had received earlier still lingered in his mind. "We know what you did." The words were brief, yet they unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Who could have known? No one should have been able to track him this quickly, not unless they had eyes everywhere. His mind raced with possibilities, but every logical explanation seemed to be a dead end. He had covered his tracks meticulously. No one should be able to find him here. Meanwhile, back in Riverton, the town had already begun to stir. Jack's sudden disappearance had sent ripples through the community. At first, it seemed like a small blip, just another case of someone going missing. But as the hours passed, it became clear that something more sinister was at play. Jack's wife, Lisa, had called the police, reporting that her husband hadn't come home from work, and she hadn't been able to reach him on the phone. By the time the authorities arrived at Jack's store, it was too late. The front door was ajar, his office was ransacked, and there were signs of a struggle. Detective Rachel Myers was the first on the scene, a sharp-witted investigator with a reputation for solving even the most perplexing cases. She immediately knew this wasn't a simple case of a missing person. The evidence was clear. Someone had taken Jack, and whoever had done it had planned it meticulously. There were no signs of forced entry, no clues that could lead her to the kidnapper's identity. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, but Detective Myers was determined. She knew Riverton like the back of her hand, and she wasn't going to let this case slip through her fingers. The investigation began in earnest, and the town soon buzzed with rumors. People were scared. This wasn't the kind of thing that happened in Riverton. The local community was used to petty crimes, but nothing like this. Nothing that involved kidnapping a well-known businessman. Every law enforcement officer in the town worked together, piecing together the few clues they had. But there was one thing no one could figure out: who had taken Jack Monroe, and why. As the investigation unfolded, a familiar name started to surface: Ethan Kerr. He had always flown under the radar, living on the outskirts of town. No one had ever been able to pin anything on him, but his name had been whispered in connection with every crime in Riverton for the last few years. He was the kind of man who knew how to manipulate people, how to blend in, and how to stay just one step ahead of the law. But even Ethan Kerr, with all his cunning, had never faced an opponent like Judge Boyd. Judge Boyd was Riverton's iron-fisted judge, known for his no-nonsense approach to the law. He had served in the town for over 20 years, and in all that time, he had earned a reputation for being fair but firm. His courtroom was a place of order, where justice was served swiftly and without bias. And though the town had grown used to his stern demeanor, there was an undeniable respect for him. People knew that Judge Boyd was a man who believed in the law, a man who would stop at nothing to see justice done. When the news of Jack Monroe's disappearance reached Judge Boyd's ears, he was already deep in thought about a series of unrelated cases. But this was different. This wasn't just another petty crime. This was something that threatened the very fabric of their small town. Someone had taken one of their own, and that couldn't go unpunished. Judge Boyd was not one to waste time. Within hours of hearing about the kidnapping, he called for an emergency session to begin organizing a coordinated response to the case. Detective Myers, with her sharp instincts, was the first to arrive at Judge Boyd's office that evening. She briefed him on the details of the investigation so far, explaining that there were no leads, no witnesses, and no clear suspects. But as she spoke, she noticed something in the judge's demeanor that made her pause. His calmness wasn't just a facade. It was a deep, unshakable certainty that he knew something she didn't. "Ethan Kerr," Judge Boyd said quietly, interrupting her mid-sentence. "Have you looked into him?" Detective Myers was taken aback. "Ethan Kerr. He's been a suspect in several cases, but we don't have any solid evidence to connect him to this one." Judge Boyd leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together thoughtfully. "You don't need evidence. You need a strategy. Ethan Kerr thinks he's smarter than everyone. He always has. But even the most cunning criminals make mistakes, Detective. They think they're invisible, but they're not. We just need to look at the bigger picture." Judge Boyd's words hung in the air as Detective Myers absorbed them. There was a new sense of determination in the air, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't as far from solving this case as they had thought. Back in the cabin, Ethan's unease only grew stronger. As the day stretched into night, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. He didn't recognize the number, but something about it felt different. His fingers trembled as he answered. "Ethan Kerr," the voice on the other end said, its tone cold and calculating. "You think you've outsmarted the system, but I know who you are. I know what you've done." Ethan's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. Someone knew, and they were closing in. The walls that Ethan had so carefully built around himself were beginning to crumble. And the worst part, he knew that no matter how carefully he had planned this, he couldn't escape the reality that was coming for him. Judge Boyd's resolve was unwavering. The law would catch up with him. He couldn't hide forever. The days that followed felt like an eternity to Ethan Kerr. His nerves were frayed, his once unshakable confidence now replaced by a gnawing dread that grew with each passing moment. The phone call had shaken him, but it had also made him more paranoid, more determined to make sure his plan didn't fall apart. He had anticipated every move, calculated every risk, But there was something about the warning on the other end of the line that made his stomach churn. Whoever had sent that message had seen through his game. They knew what he had done, and they were coming for him. Still, Ethan pushed those thoughts to the back of his mind. He had the victim, he had the ransom, and he had the cabin in the woods where he could lie low until everything was over. His plan was simple: get the money, disappear, and never look back. But as each hour ticked by, the pressure of waiting, of not knowing what was happening outside, began to weigh on him. Meanwhile, the investigation in Riverton had taken a sharp turn. The police had narrowed down their suspect list to a few individuals, but it was Ethan who stood out as the most likely candidate. Detective Rachel Myers had spent countless hours combing through old case files, following leads and questioning locals, but it wasn't until she spoke with a few old acquaintances of Ethan's that the pieces began to fall into place. His past was riddled with criminal activity, his name popping up in connection with everything from small-time thefts to more serious crimes. But no one had ever been able to prove anything. That was until now. Judge Boyd had been following the investigation closely, staying in constant communication with Detective Myers. He had already formed his own theory. Ethan Kerr had always believed he could outsmart the justice system, but Judge Boyd knew better. There was something about Ethan's arrogance, the way he had always slipped through the cracks, that made Boyd believe this time would be different. Boyd had seen enough criminals come and go in his courtroom to recognize the patterns, the signs of a man who thought he was above the law. And he knew that Ethan's smugness would ultimately be his downfall. The moment Ethan had decided to take Jack Monroe was a pivotal one, and it was clear now that the consequences of his actions were starting to unfold. Judge Boyd didn't believe in coincidences, and he didn't believe in luck. Every crime, every decision, led to a reckoning, and he was determined to make sure that Ethan Kerr faced his. The tension reached its breaking point when the police, acting on a hunch, tracked down one of Ethan's old hideouts, a secluded cabin deep in the woods. It had taken them days to find it, and by the time they arrived, they were ready for action. The police had been working tirelessly, piecing together every scrap of evidence, every rumor, every small lead, until they had narrowed down Ethan's location. They had no idea what they would find when they arrived at the cabin, but they knew one thing for certain: they had to act fast. Ethan had spent the day pacing, lost in his own thoughts, constantly checking the phone for updates. There was still no word from Jack's wife, no ransom payment, no sign of the authorities catching on. Everything had seemed to be in his favor, but deep down, Ethan knew that the law was closing in. The closer they got to solving the case, the more desperate Ethan became. He couldn't afford to get caught now, not after everything he had done. The moment came when the door to the cabin burst open. Ethan had no time to react. The police swarmed the room, their guns drawn, their voices commanding. Ethan's heart raced as he realized that his time had run out. The very people he had spent so much time outwitting were now standing right in front of him. The smug confidence that had carried him through years of criminal activity evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, biting fear. "Ethan Kerr, you're under arrest for the kidnapping of Jack Monroe," one of the officers said, his voice stern. Ethan didn't resist. He couldn't. There was nothing left to fight for. The shackles clicked shut around his wrists, the weight of the metal chains a stark reminder that his freedom was gone. His mind was reeling, trying to process the reality of the situation. He had been so sure, so confident, that he had planned every detail perfectly. But the moment he stepped into that cabin, he had sealed his fate. As they led him out of the cabin and into the waiting police car, Ethan couldn't help but think of Judge Boyd, the man who had been waiting, watching, knowing that Ethan would slip up. Ethan had always thought he was too clever for the law, but it was clear now that Judge Boyd's unwavering commitment to justice had won. Ethan Kerr had underestimated the system, and now he was going to pay the price. The town of Riverton had been rocked to its core by the kidnapping, but now, as Ethan was carted away in handcuffs, a sense of relief began to spread. Jack Monroe, though traumatized, was free. the community could begin to heal. But for Ethan, the real punishment was just beginning. As the police car disappeared into the distance, the whispers around town grew louder. People had known there was something off about him, but they had never imagined that he could commit such a heinous crime. Back in the courtroom, Judge Boyd was already preparing for the next phase, the trial. He had seen many criminals come and go, but this case was different. Ethan Kerr was no ordinary criminal, and his arrogance would make his fall from grace all the more satisfying. Judge Boyd was determined to see justice served, no matter how long it took. Ethan had believed he could outsmart the system, but now it was clear that the law had caught up with him, and there would be no escape. As the days passed, the town began to return to normal. The fear that had gripped the community started to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of trust in the justice system. But for Ethan, there was no going back. His fate had been sealed, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. The smug kidnapper who had thought he could outwit Judge Boyd was about to learn a hard lesson. Justice always finds a way. The days following Ethan Kerr's arrest were marked by a sense of disbelief that slowly turned into acceptance. The town of Riverton, which had once felt safe and predictable, now found itself grappling with the consequences of Ethan's crime. There was a palpable shift in the air, an unease that lingered even as life began to return to normal. For Jack Monroe, the trauma of his kidnapping had left deep scars, ones that would take time to heal. While he had been freed physically, the emotional toll would not be as easy to shake. The community rallied behind him, offering support, but the damage was done. Jack's name was no longer just tied to his business successes. It was now forever linked to a crime that shook the very core of Riverton. For Ethan, the fallout had only just begun. His smugness, which had once defined him, now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the stark reality of his situation. He had always believed that he could outwit the system, that no one could catch him, but here he was, sitting in a holding cell, facing charges that would ensure he would never see freedom again. His world had crumbled in the span of just a few days, and with every passing moment, he realized just how far he had fallen. The carefully crafted persona he had spent years building was now nothing but ashes. As Ethan sat alone in his cell, he couldn't help but replay the events that had led him here. He had been so sure, so confident that he could pull off the perfect crime. But he had underestimated the law, underestimated Judge Boyd. The thought of the judge, calm and resolute, standing at the helm of justice, made Ethan's stomach twist. Boyd had seen through his facade, had known that he was nothing more than a man who believed his own lies. The trial was fast approaching, and Ethan knew there would be no easy way out. There were no more tricks to play, no more moves to make. The consequences of his actions were inescapable. As he prepared for his day in court, Ethan couldn't ignore the mounting fear that gnawed at him. He had always been able to talk his way out of trouble, to manipulate situations to his advantage. But this was different. The evidence against him was irrefutable, and the public's anger was a force that even he couldn't deflect. It was no longer about the money or the thrill of outsmarting the system. It was about facing the reality of his life choices. Ethan had never imagined a life behind bars. His vision of the future had always been one of freedom, power, and control. Now, he was facing a lifetime of confinement. Meanwhile, Judge Boyd's reputation had only grown stronger in the aftermath of the kidnapping. Riverton had watched in awe as the judicial system worked swiftly and efficiently to bring the criminal to justice. Judge Boyd's steady leadership had restored a sense of order to the town, and people began to talk about how the law had triumphed over the criminal mind. There was no room for doubt in the minds of Riverton's residents. Justice had prevailed. The trial of Ethan Kerr was a spectacle in its own right, attracting attention from both local and regional media. People filled the courtroom, eager to see the smug kidnapper face the consequences of his actions. The prosecution's case was airtight, with overwhelming evidence that pointed directly to Ethan as the mastermind behind the kidnapping. The victim, Jack Monroe, took the stand, his voice shaking as he recounted the horrors of being held captive in the cabin. The pain in Jack's eyes was unmistakable, a reminder of the deep scars that would linger long after the trial was over. As Ethan sat in the defendant's chair, he could feel the weight of the community's anger bearing down on him. The eyes of everyone in the room were on him, their judgment as clear as the evidence laid out before them. He had no more lies to tell, no more games to play. The gavel was about to fall, and Ethan knew there would be no mercy. When Judge Boyd took his seat, the entire room fell silent. The judge's calm, composed demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous days, and yet there was a palpable sense of power that emanated from him. He was the embodiment of justice, unflinching and resolute. He looked at Ethan, whose face was a mask of defiance, and then at Jack, who had endured the trauma of being taken from his family and held captive. Boyd knew the stakes of this trial, not just for Ethan, but for the entire community. A verdict in this case would send a message to everyone in Riverton. No one, no matter how clever or powerful, was beyond the reach of the law. The trial proceeded, each witness giving their testimony, each piece of evidence further solidifying Ethan's guilt. His lawyer tried to argue for leniency, claiming that Ethan's actions had been driven by desperation and poor judgment. But the prosecution countered with the cold, hard facts. Ethan had planned the kidnapping meticulously, without remorse or hesitation. There was no sign of the man who once thought of himself as untouchable, only a man who now realized the full extent of his mistake. When it was finally time for Ethan to speak, he stood before the court, his voice hollow, almost unrecognizable. He offered no apology, no remorse for the pain he had caused. Instead, he spoke of his frustration, his belief that he had been wronged by society, that he had been forced into a life of crime because of circumstances beyond his control. But the words fell flat. The judge, the jury, and the people of Riverton had heard it all before. It wasn't enough. None of it mattered now. Judge Boyd listened carefully, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. He had heard many such speeches in his years on the bench. But what Ethan didn't understand was that remorse wasn't something that could be faked. Boyd had seen through his self-pity, through his anger. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions, and Ethan's refusal to take responsibility only made the situation worse. Boyd had no choice but to deliver a sentence that would ensure Ethan would never again walk free. The verdict was swift. Ethan Kerr was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. The weight of the gavel's strike reverberated through the courtroom, sealing Ethan's fate. The community, which had once been gripped by fear, now felt a sense of closure. The kidnapper who had believed he was smarter than everyone else was now just another inmate in the system he had once thought he could beat. In the weeks and months that followed, Riverton slowly began to heal. Jack Monroe's recovery was long and difficult, but with the support of his family and the community, he eventually found a way to move forward. He had been freed physically, but the scars of his ordeal would take much longer to fade. The town rallied around him, showing him that while the damage had been done, there was still hope. For Ethan, the reality of his life sentence was a bitter pill to swallow. His days were now filled with routine and confinement. There were no more escapes, no more plans. He had become just another face in the crowd, a cautionary tale for those who thought they could outwit the system. In his mind, he was still the man who had believed he was above the law. But in the eyes of Judge Boyd, and in the eyes of Riverton, Ethan Kerr was nothing more than a criminal who had been caught. The town had learned a hard lesson. No matter how cunning, no matter how confident one might be, the law would always prevail. And for Judge Boyd, the satisfaction came not from the conviction, but from knowing that justice had been served. The smug kidnapper who thought he could outsmart the system had learned the ultimate truth. In the end, no one could escape the consequences of their actions. As time passed, the town of Riverton began to settle into its new normal, but the shadows of what had happened still lingered. For Judge Boyd, the weight of the case never truly lifted. While the community had slowly healed from the fear and uncertainty brought on by Ethan Kerr's crime, There were moments when Boyd found himself reflecting on the deeper implications of the case, the questions it had raised, the lessons it had taught. Though justice had been served in the courtroom, the true cost of Ethan's actions was still reverberating through the town, touching everyone in ways they hadn't fully understood at the time. For Jack Monroe, the road to recovery was long and uncertain. He had been freed physically, but the scars of his captivity ran deeper than anyone could see. The emotional toll of the kidnapping had shaken him to his core. Though he was surrounded by family, friends, and a community that rallied behind him, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. The person he had once been, confident, strong, and successful, now felt like a distant memory. There were moments when he found himself questioning whether he would ever feel truly safe again, whether the weight of what had happened would ever fully leave him. He sought therapy, trying to make sense of the trauma, trying to rebuild the life he had lost. But the path to healing was not a straight one. He knew, deep down, that the process would take time, but he was determined to reclaim his life. The community, too, was left to grapple with what had happened. Riverton was a small town where everyone knew each other's names. It had been a place where things like this simply didn't happen, or at least it was a place where people never imagined such a thing could occur. The fear and distrust that had once taken root now began to dissipate, but the questions lingered. Could something like this happen again? How did they allow someone like Ethan Kerr to slip through the cracks for so long? Was there a way to prevent such a tragedy in the future? As the months passed, the town began to rebuild in ways both visible and subtle. People returned to their routines, their businesses, their families. There was a renewed sense of vigilance in Riverton, a reminder that things could change in an instant, and that sometimes justice came at a great cost. But there was also a quiet underlying hope that the worst was behind them, that the darkness that had once descended on their town had lifted, replaced by the promise of a safer, stronger future. Judge Boyd, too, had his own reflections. While the case had concluded in the way he had hoped, with Ethan Kerr facing the full weight of his actions, Boyd couldn't shake the feeling that something more profound had been revealed. In his years on the bench, he had seen countless criminals pass through his courtroom, each with their own story, their own justifications and excuses. But Ethan Kerr had been different. Boyd had known from the very beginning that this case was not just about a single crime. It was about something bigger: the fallibility of the justice system, the temptation of power, and the human capacity for self-deception. He had watched as Ethan tried to manipulate his way out of responsibility, trying to convince everyone around him that he was the victim, that his actions had been forced upon him by circumstance. It was a game Boyd had seen time and again, but in Ethan's case, the stakes were much higher. As Boyd sat in his office, looking out over the town that had entrusted him with its sense of justice, he found himself reflecting on his own role in it all. Was he really just a figure of the law, someone who handed down sentences and enforced order, or was he, too, a part of the system that shaped the lives of those he judged? He couldn't help but wonder if there was more he could have done to prevent Ethan from slipping into a life of crime, if he could have done more to see through the cracks in the man's carefully constructed persona. Judge Boyd had always prided himself on his ability to see through lies, to spot deception from a mile away. But Ethan had been different. The kidnapper had always thought of himself as untouchable, a man who could outsmart the system. Boyd knew, deep down, that there was a part of him that admired Ethan's audacity, even as he condemned his actions. But that admiration was fleeting. Ethan had proven, in the end, that there was nothing more dangerous than a man who believed he could escape the consequences of his choices. The lessons from the case, for Boyd, were not just academic. They were deeply personal. The idea that justice was a process, one that required patience, perseverance, and a firm belief in the system, had been tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about sentencing criminals. It was about understanding why they chose the paths they did, and what could be done to prevent more from following in their footsteps. Boyd had always been a firm believer in the law, but he was starting to understand that there was more to justice than just handing down punishments. There was a human element to it, a recognition of the fragility of the choices people made and the long-lasting consequences those choices had on others. For the town of Riverton, the final chapter of Ethan Care's story was, in many ways, just the beginning. It had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own assumptions, about the people they had trusted and the ones they had overlooked. But more than anything, it had shown them the importance of community. In the wake of Ethan's crime, Riverton had come together in a way that no one had expected. People who had once been strangers now shared a bond forged in fear and healing. They knew that no one was truly untouchable, that anyone could become a victim, and anyone could be a perpetrator. But through their collective strength, they had endured. In the years to come, Riverton would remember Ethan Care as the man who thought he could outsmart the law. His name would be synonymous with the lesson that justice, no matter how long it takes, always catches up. And as for Judge Boyd, while the case would be added to the countless others he had presided over in his career, he knew that this one would stay with him for a long time. It had reminded him of his duty, not just as a judge, but as a man who believed in the power of accountability, in the belief that the choices we make shape the world around us. He had witnessed firsthand how the justice system worked, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of the people who sought it. The story of Ethan Care had ended, but the lessons it left behind would echo for years to come. And as the town of Riverton moved forward, so too did the question. What happens when we believe we can escape the consequences of our actions? And how long does it take for those consequences to find us, no matter how hard we run?